I thank Jochen for as giving his view. Just to recall Hegel, I would say that we have seen so far thesis and antithesis in a certain sense. I ask Rainer to make the synthesis. Obviously, I'm joking. We will have also the speech of Wolfgang and then a round table in which we will discuss all the topics. As you have seen, in any case, definitely by using the same figures, and this is, since I am used to be a mathematician, so it's fantastic that in economics, where I am a guest, actually, the same figures gives different results. Even if in stochastic calculus, I mean, when you solve the, for example, geometric Brownian motion with the famous solution of the exponential random walk, you still have the same solution. In economics, it seems that we look at the same figures and we find completely different considerations, arguments, and it's nice and interesting. But I will promise that during the round table, I will put all the figures on the table and we start to make all the computation correctly. Obviously, I'm joking, and I ask Rainer to come to our desk and to start with this intervention that definitely will be interest as the previous one.
Let me thank Marcello for this outstanding opportunity. Let me thank all participants for wishing to listen to my thoughts. My task is indeed an impossible task. It's mission impossible. How can I try and reconcile the views so cogently put forward by Marcello and the views equally well presented by Jochen? Beyond certain types of similarity, there is a fundamental distinction. There is a gulf in the two presentations. Burden sharing is the hallmark, if I were to use a word, of Jochen's intervention, while risk sharing is the key word, the key concept in Marcello. And it is difficult to reconcile the two. If I may suggest that how the reconciliation takes place, this falls outside the domain of economics. It is fundamentally political and it is fundamentally social. It's faith. My impression is that for wrong or perhaps more for right reasons, our German friends do not have full faith in the Italian processes and in the Italian policies. And if this is the case, it is difficult to reconcile the 2 points of view from an economic angle. Let me add just a word along these lines. We had twice unique opportunities given by the euro adoption, lowering of expenditure, significant lowering of expenditure, and what should have been the answer of the Italian governments to reduce other expenditures, to make it possible to reduce in a very significant way the debt-to-income ratio. At the same time, and Marcello was perfectly right, it would have been appropriate to increase our investment expenditure. But, and here I slightly disagree, I take the liberty with Marcello, we need private and public investment expenditure, and I believe that the Juncker plan is highly appropriate, and we are following it, and we should follow it even more. But the problem with Italy is that a large part of public expenditure is intermingled with corruption, with inefficiency, with poor response to economic factors. And this happens, I would say, above all, in certain areas of the regions, the comuni, and the other local authorities. So we need to address this problem first and foremost, because unless we increase not expenditure as such, but the quality of expenditure, we are bound to continue to have difficulties, and our German friends will rightly point to us that we do not move in the right direction. One final word on this issue. The Bank of Italy, but also the ISTAT, the National Accounting Office, indicates that in the past 15 years, a large part of public expenditure was not even recorded on the capital account. Why? Because it was so inefficient as not to warrant a capital connotation. It was expenditure, and all expenditures have, of course, current expenditures have a role in the GDP, but it is a negative role because it goes hand in hand, I repeat, with corruption. And I can say that with the experience coming from a former minister of the budget. By the way, the Dini government was the first government in 20 years to let the debt-to-income ratio decline very significantly, although our government was there for a year and a half only. And therefore, I think I can speak with some knowledge of what I'm talking about. But having said that, as a general premise, I have not prepared the slides as such. I don't know whether can I use the document I sent, or yes?
You didn't have the pen drive?
On the pen drive, yes. You have it? No, it was given. And I will start. This one here.
Okay. This one.
I will use for my presentation a paper I have been asked to prepare for a Palgrave book, which will be shortly forthcoming. And I will start with 6 paradoxes, which to my mind, they have not even been mentioned by anybody, and yet they are, to my mind, very clearly relevant. The first one is the inflation paradox. We live in the world, the EU world, where, according to my friend Issing, the best, most tested relationship which exists is the one between the monetary base, money supply, and prices. There is a stable demand for money function, there is a stable money supply function. This is not true. But nobody dares ask whether this principle of the European Union is still valid. At times, somebody in the European Union begins to say, well, look here, but perhaps prices are not going to increase because wages are not increasing because there is high unemployment. The point I'm making, this is a fundamentally wrong proposition. In the long term, obviously, if you increase money over the productive potential, you are bound to have inflation. But inflation can jump, or inflation can take a slower pace. The point, however, I'm making is that in the past 15 years, we have been using this false premise as the key principle of monetary policy, which had enormous adverse implications. The enormous adverse implications is that we tried to fight first inflation, but then deflation, with excessive monetary creation. And so we had a wrong policy mix. Fiscal policy was going in one way, and monetary policy was going in the other way, with huge repercussions on the real economy. So this is the first paradox to which I was referring. The second one is the liquidity trap, which is to some extent linked to the other one. Why is it that this huge monetary base expansion did not lead to true liquidity expansion? Indeed, if you read my paper, the opposite is true. One of the dangers of the quantitative easing is that liquidity on fundamental debt instruments declined because all the debt was bought by the central bank, and therefore you reach the paradoxical situation whereby debt, which should become very liquid, is illiquid. A paradox of saving. Our German friends do not like this idea because it sounds as if it is connected to John Maynard Keynes. Adam Smith was the first to point to the possibility of the paradox of saving. If everybody tries to save more at the same time, and if investments stays given, income will fall, and this is something which has happened. Paradox of the leveraging. I will not go into details because time is running short. The paradox of central banks' balance sheet independence from government debt. They are all linked, although they are logically separate. You recall what happened in Italy when we had this huge discussion on the need to separate the Banca d'Italia from the Treasury. This was necessary to give full freedom to the Banca d'Italia. Perhaps it was, but certainly the ratio of debt to assets held by the central bank have never been as high as now. And therefore something even here should be reconsidered. The paradox of bank capital, this again was not even mentioned. My contention is that these huge increases we had in capital for banks were, from a certain point of view, the right move, because we need a more resilient banking system. But there is a question of timing, and there is a question of degree through which you can push banks to have more and more capital. If you do this at the cost of less credit, you're bound to have repercussions, notably for small, medium-sized enterprise. The second dip of the recession in Italy, the crucial one, from 2010 onwards, I have little doubt, and I have ample evidence to show that this was indeed the case. In any event, my point is simply the following. There is significant evidence coming from within central banks, although it tends to be brushed aside, that capital requirements have now become a key instrument of monetary policy, Reserve requirements are out of the way, and therefore you can have the situation in the ECB whereby, to put names, Draghi tries to push, but Madame Nui, by increasing capital requirements, makes it difficult for monetary policy to work. More generally, my contention is that the European Union is a complex economic system where exogenous, endogenous, and systemic risk permeate the workings, but where the fundamental point is you must have a holistic, integrated look at the whole picture. Otherwise, you're bound to have problems. And the problems come from mathematical economics and statistics. Why? Because in a complex system, the links and nodes can play very tricky roles. Indeed, it may happen that you jump immediately from a situation of power law, from a situation from normal distribution to power laws. You have cusps and you have sudden crisis. This is indeed what happened and what can happen. Put it otherwise, What we need is a complex system representation of macroprudential and other economic policies. This, in theory, is accepted by everybody. I was a member of the De La Rosière group, and this was one of the ideas behind the De La Rosière group. Much the same thing happened in the United States with the Dodd-Frank Act. Macroprudential policy is the overarching policy. Why? Because it deals with the issue of stability, financial and economic stability. All other policies are not independent. This is another relic of the past. You recall Tinbergen and all these nice stories. Monetary policy was independent, fiscal policy was independent, and so on and so forth. No, the various policies are all interlinked, and macroprudential policy should see to it that there is not the possibility of jumping into the cusp problem, and that the links between the policies are taken duly into account. One of the crucial policies which in Europe has to be taken into account is, this again has not even been mentioned so far, is the competition state aid policy. Mind you, during the past 10 years, the largest expenditure was allowed for by competition authorities. It was 5.4 trillion euros, 5.4 trillion euros, in order to save banks, the bailout system. Not all the funds were fortunately spent, some were purely guarantees, but my point is simple. This is the key policy in shaping the EU system. Another instance is why is it that in Europe we have adopted a capital requirement system for banks which is a one-size-fits-all approach, which to my mind has very serious repercussions on the workings had and continues to have. Because DG Comp argued, rightly or wrongly in my view, that competition, fair competition in the single market required this one-size-fits-all approach. My understanding is that now this might perhaps be reconsidered, and my understanding is that our German friends are indeed pressing the European Commission to reconsider this point in the name of proportionality. Proportionality was, after all, discovered by the Prussian kings back in the at the end of the 17th century. Oh, yes. One point which I think deserves mentioning in this respect, these charts, those who want to look at them, show the strict interconnections between policies which run counter to the principle of truly independent policy and the need to have this systemic view. The systemic view, by the way, is entrusted to the European Systemic Risk Board. But can the European Systemic Risk Board, under its rules of governance, perform effectively this role? The chairman is Mr. Mario Draghi himself, so he should perhaps, at least in theory, comply with the policies pursued by the ECB in the two functions. And the governing body is composed of 60 to 70 members, so it's an impossible task. My original contention when the De La Rosière group was working was that this should have been a task given, given to Council of Economic Experts in the various countries with total independence and perhaps with a direct link with the Council of Ministers, because they should see to it that all policies were possibly subject to scrutiny. Time is running. The following charts indicate all the evidence is taken by the European Central Bank, how different the behavior of the European economy was with respect to the US economy. This is partly due, admittedly, to the existence of a financial union in the United States, right? But the financial union is a double-edged sword. It is perfectly true, and I have pointed this out in the responses to the European Commission for the midterm review, that it was necessary to go forward in that direction. We recall that the euro area has the GDP, which is half that of the United States, but has a 50% higher volume of bank assets. So the rebalancing is indeed appropriate. But the question remains, how can you reconcile this process in the short term? And I don't want, but let us refer to the Italian experience. Italian experience in the 50s and 60s was the establishment of a single financial market in Europe with enormous drawbacks in southern Italy, which were not corrected, and therefore the financial union worked as it should have, by subtracting resources from the south, and the public put new resources into the south, the worst possible system. This, by the way, is not a view put forward exclusively by myself, but in the official response of the Italian government to the need for a financial markets union, this point is recognized. I think I have to jump now, and I will, oh yes. There is another point which, again, was not mentioned. The financial union is absolutely essential, and the financial union does comprise the capital markets union. Indeed, the financial union and the economic union must go hand in hand. My friend Weidmann came here to Rome to give us a lecture, and he interprets EMU not as European Economic and Monetary Union, but as European Monetary Union. This is not the case. The EMU has been, and continues to be for the time being, the concept of economic and monetary union. So economic union and financial union should go together. In theory, this I take from the Five Presidents' report. This should be complemented by fiscal union and ultimately political union. I believe that political union belongs to the distant future, but let me recall here that the poor past President Kohl was the one who recognized the need for fiscal and political union, and indeed he went as far as saying in the Bundestag that it would have been a major mistake to try and build an EMU, European Monetary and Economic Union, without ultimately reaching political union. No, he went even more ahead, because he had asked at that point the European Council of Ministers to consider this option in the immediate future. Policy proposal. The main policy proposal I make is in line with Marcello's views, with the caveat I indicate, that is to say, the absolute need in Italy to reconsider ways and means to blend private and public expenditure in the investment area and to ameliorate the system of public expenditure. We continue to talk about bridges across I don't know how many seas, while we lack the basic infrastructure, functioning infrastructures in the cities, in the regions, and in Italy as a whole. This is a fundamental task. It was addressed in many ways by many countries, including the United States, Australia, But we have just to look at what Germany does. So it's a question of copying. This is, however, a fundamental need. And my suggestion was that for a 3-year period, the Maastricht 1 should allow for the possibility of having all expenditures which would be identified and sponsored by the European investment entities to go beyond the Maastricht strictures, not as a measure of flexibility, but as a measure to foster growth. Because, and here I conclude again, the main message, there are other messages, but the main message as an Italian, which I draw from Jochen's indication, is that, look here, you are not growing enough, your difference, R minus G, continues to be negative, and therefore you are caught. He didn't say that, I said, in a vicious trap, a vicious circle. You must increase your productivity and growth. To do that, this is what I say, you must increase investment, good investment, not poor investment, good investment, and unless you do this, it is very hard for you to catch up. I would submit before burden or risk sharing, this is the basic premise, and it is fundamentally, I submit, an Italian task. Thank you.